Hello everyone and welcome to the Green Couch Reviews. One of the things that makes talking about art so interesting is the sheer variety of approaches that there are for creators to get their points across. I mean, just looking at a single art form like film, you have dozens of different genres. Action, horror, comedy, thriller, kaiju, documentary, experimental, etc. Where things get really interesting though is when the people behind the camera start getting creative and mix things up, combining genres and coming up with new hybrid versions. And while a lot of this can result in films where the individual elements get watered down and the whole feels pretty half-baked, there are certain ones that turn out much greater than the sum of their parts. Case in point, let's take a look at Christophe Gans' 2001 historic conspiracy martial arts swashbuckling monster movie, Brotherhood of the Wolf. The year is 1765, and France's Gévaudan region is being terrorized by a monstrous creature stalking the countryside. No one knows for sure what it is or where it came from, but despite their best efforts, it's been turning the local peasantry into hamburger. At their wits' end, the court sends a special envoy, Grégoire de Fronsac, played by Samuel Le Bien, to help track down the monster and stop it from doing any more damage to both the king's people and his credibility as a ruler. Not necessarily in that order. Accompanied by his Iroquois friend Manny, his investigation uncovers a strange conspiracy among the local nobility, which aims to counter the spread of Enlightenment-era values throughout the kingdom, using the beast as a weapon of terror in the pursuit of a new religious dark age. So basically a Catholic Renaissance-era Al-Qaeda with a huge spiky armored murder machine instead of IEDs. And also, this happens. And this. And this. This movie is awesome! Brotherhood of the Wolf, Le Pacte des Loups in the original French, is one of the greatest examples I've ever seen of what I can only describe as a kitchen sink movie. It's got it all. Action, mystery, comedy, romance, horror, and Monica Bellucci, who is of course a genre unto herself. And most impressively, it's also reasonably accurate in its historical references to a large extent, especially for a pulpy action adventure piece. Incredibly, that also includes the beast itself. Mostly. Believe it or not, there actually was a real beast of Gévaudan that wreaked havoc in southern France between June 30th, 1764 and June 19th, 1767. Estimates vary, but it's thought that during this period, anywhere from 100 to 200 people were killed by what witnesses described as a huge wolf-like creature, although to date no evidence has been found to indicate that it was an actual wolf. In response to the killings, King Louis XV sent hunters and soldiers to track it down, but the beast proved far more cunning than expected and slipped from their grasp. At that point, Antoine de Beauterme, the king's weapon master, arrives on the scene and on the 21st of September 1765, seemingly kills the monster, sending the stuffed remains to be presented to the court. This turns out to be a little premature since the killings continue for another 2 years. It's long been thought that the whole thing was a giant PR move and destined to squash rumors that the king was unable to handle the situation, a point of view shared by the film. It's at this point that the movie and history really diverge, with Fronsac and Manny heading back to Gévaudan to finish off the beast once and for all. Ass-kicking naturally ensues when our heroes clash with the secret society behind the attacks, helped along by a few local allies and a Vatican spy /Corzan / Monica Bellucci. Yeah, I really like Monica Bellucci. Regardless of its many inaccuracies, and there are many, Brotherhood of the Wolf takes place in a real historical context that informs much of its thematic content. This is particularly apparent when you examine the kinds of cultural and political upheavals that were occurring in Europe at the time. The 18th century was a period characterized by the culmination of what is referred to as the Enlightenment that began during the latter half of the previous century. Also known as the Age of Reason, this philosophical and cultural movement placed such values as skepticism, individuality, intelligence, and tolerance to the forefront. This made it a perfect accompaniment to the scientific revolution that was occurring at the time, as the stated goal of Enlightenment philosophies was the use of reason and humanism to reform those societies previously based on superstition, dogmatic tradition, and religious faith. And at the time, that meant pretty much all of them. As one can imagine, being the preeminent religious authority in Europe at the time, the Catholic Church took the brunt of this. The other group that got hit was royalty, since the divine right of kings, which is to say the idea that God had decided that such and such bloodline would be in charge and could do pretty much whatever they wanted, was a frequent justification for their continued rule. In France, this, along with economic mismanagement and the loss of the North American colonies to the English after the Seven-Year War, would eventually result in the Revolution of 1792 and several important royal heads being forcibly separated from their respective bodies. The conflict in the movie is in a sense a reflection of the larger historical conflict occurring around it, the isolated region of Gévaudan standing in for a France that's being dragged kicking and screaming into the modern age. Our protagonists here represent the forces of progress, whilst their enemies are instead examples of dogmatic conservatism and repression. This is also represented in the film via the casting. Our hero's main allies are played by, at the time, relatively new actors like Jérémy Régnier and especially Émilie Dequesne, for whom this was her second feature film. Meanwhile, the aristocrats that form the Brotherhood are played by seasoned veterans of French cinema, such as Bernard Farcy, Edith Scob, and Jean-François Stévenin, all with careers going back well into the 1960s or even earlier. This contrast between the two eras of actors helps visually illustrate the division between the new generation, who embraces the Enlightenment values on the one hand, and the established nobility trying to bring things back to the good old days on the other.
Les temps changent. Pas partout, Fronsac. En tout cas pas ici.
There are exceptions, Vincent Cassel's Jean-François de Morangias being the main one, but then again he has a much different role in the film. We'll get back to him later. But enough with the history lesson. After all, there's more to Brotherhood of the Wolf than just a loose, inspired by true events story. What Christophe Gans accomplished with this film was to create something that was uniquely his, by taking that premise and infusing it with his own interests. Gans has always been a fan of genre cinema, starting with his own movie zine at a young age and becoming the editor-in-chief of Starfix magazine at 22, where he defended the work of such cult figures as Argento, Bava, Carpenter, and Cronenberg. So naturally, when he started making his own movies, these many disparate influences were featured, both in his choice of projects and the way they were made. In the case of Brotherhood, this translates to a very visual, stylized type of cinematography, coupled with numerous camera and editing flourishes that help give the result a particular flavor. For instance, this shot following a woman as she passed through curtains into a larger space is a clear quotation of a similar scene in Argento's Suspiria. And speaking of Italian horror movies, long POV shots such as this one are characteristics of the giallo thrillers of that country, especially during their heyday in the 60s and 70s. Meanwhile, certain scenes have an almost spaghetti western feel to them, especially when coupled with a score that at times sounds like an 18th century Ennio Morricone, courtesy of composer Joseph Leduca, but with a color scheme far more vibrant and, dare I say, French than was common in that genre. Not to mention the occasional Cocteau reference for those who are really paying attention. And lest we forget, Gans isn't only a film buff. Over the years he's also been a vocal proponent of comic books and video games as their own unique art forms. For example, a great deal of the set design was inspired by the 70s comics he grew up with, along with the pulp adventure novels that originated them, with the bad guy's underground lair being a prime example. The framing of many shots is also very reminiscent of comic book panels. And let's not forget Fronsac's drawing habit, featuring creations by French illustrator Mathieu Lefray. As for the video game aspect, the scene where our heroes lure the beast into a trap-riddled quarry was designed to appear straight out of a boss fight, the angular stone walls having been colored a uniform green to emphasize that aesthetic. And take a look at this. Three words. Renaissance Splinter Cell. Of course, being a hodgepodge of different elements will inevitably cause some issues. For instance, the last third of the film feels somewhat streamlined compared to the earlier parts, piling the twists one on top of another in a rush to get to the ending, losing in subtlety what it gains in action. Also, the pulp adventure style does lend itself to a more archetypal rather than deep characterization, not to mention that some of those archetypes can be somewhat old-fashioned, shall we say.
Pourrais-tu te reproduire avec une femme de notre race?
Manny, in particular, is sadly a textbook example of the noble savage cliché, despite being an otherwise great character. Of course, this basis in old-school adventure fiction does bring up one thing that I wish more films would do. Fighting as exposition. The idea here is that the way a character fights informs us about who they are. This is most common in martial arts and swashbuckler films, two genres that greatly inform the style of combat used in Brotherhood of the Wolf. In Manny's fights, for instance, he's the only combatant to retain a straight posture throughout, implying a greater moral rectitude than his opponents, who are, more often than not, depicted hunched over and snarling like something straight out of Mordor. Meanwhile, de Fronsac doesn't get involved at first, keeping to the sidelines for the most part and sticking to firearms when called upon. He comes across more as a thinker than a fighter, despite having been a soldier during the 7-Year War. And then his best friend and blood brother gets shot in the back and dumped in a ditch. Yeah. Suddenly, de Fronsac doesn't just start fighting, he starts fighting more and more like Magny, divesting himself of modern weapons, wearing his friend's clothes, even going so far as to scalp his enemies during his final confrontation with the Brotherhood. This is something that also happens quite a bit in classical martial arts films, where the hero will battle the villain using his fallen ally's fighting style in order to honor his memory, sometimes creating an entirely new one by mixing it with his own. This informs de Fronsac's choice of twin daggers for the last fight of the movie, where he essentially embodies both Magny and himself as he lays waste to his enemies. Speaking of his enemies, remember when I said I'd get back to Jean-François de Morangias? Well, it turns out that he's the only one of the bad guys who's capable of facing Fronsac one-on-one, and for good reason, too. From a narrative standpoint, Morangias serves as de Fronsac's primary antagonist, each man's background being a reflection of the other's. Both left France to go to what was at the time the far reaches of Western civilization, North America for Grégoire and Africa for Jean-François. Both suffered traumas on either frontier, the massacres of the natives during the war and the damage to his right arm, respectively. They're both in love with the same woman. Ew. And of course, neither came back alone from their travels. The difference being that de Fronsac brought back Magny, someone who he considered his own flesh and blood, and in a sense, who helped keep him grounded. Mr. Morangias, on the other hand, brought back a monster. With this in mind, let's look at this last fight between them. Both men are, in a sense, finally putting their inner selves on display for all to see. For de Fronsac, this means becoming a cross between a French soldier and Iroquois warrior, dual-wielding European blades while bearing native war paint. He embodies at this point both his own culture and ideals as well as those of his fallen brother. De Morangias, on the other hand, reveals himself as something bestial hiding underneath a layer of aristocratic finery. His hideously scarred right arm is in plain view, and he fights with a treacherous bone sword that transforms into a flail at a moment's notice. Yet despite its foreign appearance and likely origins, a Catholic rosary hangs from its hilt. At this point, he's not only the beast's master, but its incarnation in human form, a monster trained in the name of a fundamentalist ideology by the Brotherhood, and then set loose on an unsuspecting France. Once again, we see the central thematic conceit of the film brought to the forefront, made all the more clear through the pulp adventure aesthetic that Gans uses throughout the film. And there I think is why I like this film so much. Despite having a message that it clearly wanted to put forth, Brotherhood of the Wolf remains above all else an exciting piece of just pure entertainment. The whole film is filled to the brim with a love of cinema that makes what might otherwise have been an impossible contradiction of genres and tones sing with energy. In directing it, Christophe Gans made the kind of movie that he would want to see, filmed with wonderful images, interesting characters, and daring technical choices. Basically, he did what one might expect of a massive film geek who's living the dream and getting to create the art that will hopefully inspire the next generation of filmmakers just like he was. And as a genre fan myself, I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm Bastian, and I'll see you next time on the couch.